The truth has been hidden long enough. They lied about how he died, they lied about what killed him, and the whole sport looked the other way for years while it was happening. Today, that changes. Ken Caminiti was 41 years old. He was found collapsed in a Bronx apartment on October 10, 2004. The headlines that day said heart attack. His agent said heart attack. The sport moved on and tried to forget. But that was not the truth, not even close. And by the time this video is done, you are going to understand exactly what the truth was, why it was buried, and why it matters more today than most people want to admit. The real story behind Ken Caminiti is darker than the headlines. It is sadder than the obituaries. And it is more important than most baseball stories you will ever hear. Because what happened to him did not start in that Bronx apartment. It started decades earlier. It started with a little boy who went through something no child should ever have to go through. It started with a sport that told him to push through the pain, no matter what. It started with a culture that handed him chemicals and called it preparation. It ended with a man alone in a bathroom, trying one last time to turn off a pain that had been burning inside him since he was a kid. To understand the end, you have to rewind. And when you do, you are going to see something baseball does not want you to see. You're going to see a system that built a Superman, extracted everything it could from him, and then walked away when there was nothing left to take. If this story deserves your attention, show it some love right now. Hit that hype button and give this video a boost. It only takes 1 second, and it means everything to this channel. Now let us get into it. Ken Caminiti was born to play baseball. That much was obvious from the moment he stepped onto a field. He played with a fire that most players never find and few can sustain. He was not just talented. He was the kind of player who made everyone around him better. The kind of presence in a dugout that raises the energy of every person in it. He played third base for the San Diego Padres with an intensity that was difficult to describe unless you saw it up close. He was not the highest paid player in the league. He was not on the cover of every magazine, but when the game was on the line and everything was at stake, he was exactly the player you wanted standing in that batter's box. His teammates called him the heart and soul of the clubhouse. Coaches said it, writers said it, fans felt it. He was the kind of guy who would throw his body into a wall to save a run in a game that had no real stakes. He played hurt when most players would have sat down and nobody would have blamed them. He played hard in April the same way he played hard in October. That reputation, that image of a man who never quit and never backed down, became the most admired thing about him. It also became the most dangerous thing about him, because behind that image was a man carrying tremendous pain. Physical pain from years of injuries, emotional pain that ran far deeper than any rotator cuff or bruised rib, pain that went back much further than any baseball field, pain that the sport was perfectly happy to ignore as long as he kept performing. The 1996 season is where most conversations about Ken Caminiti begin, and it makes sense why. What he did that year was historic by any measure. He hit 326. He drove in 130 runs, a single-season Padres record that still stands today. He hit 40 home runs. His slugging percentage was .621, a franchise record that reflected pure, undeniable power. His wins above replacement that year was 7.5, the highest total across his entire 15-season career. He won the National League Most Valuable Player award and was praised everywhere as the engine behind the San Diego Padres' remarkable run that year. He did all of that while playing through injuries that should have ended his season months earlier. But here's the part that changes the meaning of those numbers. Here's the part that explains them in a completely different light. Ken Caminiti had a torn rotator cuff. He had multiple chronic physical problems that would have placed most athletes on the disabled list without a second thought. The reason he was able to play through all of that, the reason those statistics look the way they do, is because he was using anabolic steroids. He admitted it himself years later. He described the experience of using performance-enhancing drugs as feeling like Superman. That one word says everything. Not just better, not just stronger, Superman. Like he had temporarily stepped outside the boundaries of human limitation. Like pain was something that happened to other people. Like his body could handle anything the game threw at it, no matter how broken it actually was underneath. That feeling was a lie. A very powerful, very convincing lie, but a lie. Once you feel that way, once you have tasted what it is like to perform at that level without the ceiling of your injuries holding you back, it becomes almost impossible to let go. Because the moment you stop, the ceiling comes back. The injuries return, the performance drops. And with the performance goes the identity. This is where the trap snapped shut. The steroids allowed him to play through the injury. Playing through the injury let him perform at a historic level. Performing at that level made the team, the organization, the media, and the fans adore him. And all of that adoration created an expectation that he would always be Superman. And meeting that expectation required keeping the secret going. So he kept using, and the price of that bargain grew a little larger every day, quietly accumulating in the muscle of his heart. Think about what that means in practical terms. He could not tell the trainer the full story of his pain. He could not tell the team doctor what he was using to push through. He could not say to anyone in the organization, "I am not okay and I have not been okay for a while." Because saying any of those things risked the whole performance. It risked the identity. It risked the job. So he stayed silent. He kept the mask on. And the isolation that came with that silence became another layer of pressure on top of everything else he was already carrying. Every man who has ever felt like he had to hold everything together alone knows some small version of what that feels like. For Ken Caminiti, it was the weight of an entire season, an entire career, built on a foundation that he could never let anyone examine too closely. He later told Sports Illustrated that he initially felt like a cheater when he first started using. That is an honest admission, and it says something good about his conscience. But then he added something even more revealing. He said that PED use was so widespread throughout the league that it stopped feeling like cheating and started feeling like a requirement, like the real unfair disadvantage was choosing not to use when everyone around you was. The culture normalized it. And when an entire culture normalizes something, it is very difficult for any individual inside that culture to see it clearly as the destructive force it actually is. Now, before we go deeper into the chemical story, there is one specific moment from 1996 that you need to understand, because this moment captures the entire problem with how baseball treated Ken Caminiti. It captures why the praise he received was actually a kind of poison. It was mid-August of 1996. The Padres were playing a 3-game series against the New York Mets in Monterrey, Mexico, one of baseball's early ventures into international play, and Ken Caminiti was in bad shape. He had severe food poisoning. His body was so depleted from dehydration that the team trainers connected him to an intravenous drip and pushed 2 full liters of fluid into his system before the game. 2 liters. His body was running on empty and his stomach was in revolt. Any reasonable person would have sat that game out. The situation was medical, not motivational. Resting would have been the smart and sensible choice, but Ken Caminiti was not built to sit. Right before the final game of the series, he grabbed a Snickers bar for a quick burst of sugar, pulled himself together, walked out onto that field, and proceeded to hit 2 home runs in an 8-0 San Diego victory. The crowd loved it. The media loved it. The legend of Ken Caminiti grew a little larger that night. That game became known as the Snickers game, and for years afterward it was told as a story of pure, old-fashioned grit, toughness, heart, what a real baseball player looks like. And yes, on one level, it is an impressive performance. That part is undeniable. But let us look at it from a different angle, because this is where the story starts to change. What baseball actually did that day was stand up and cheer for a man who had just overridden every signal his own body was trying to send him. It rewarded him for ignoring his physical limits. It held him up as the ideal, as the model every other player should aspire to, precisely because he refused to take care of himself when taking care of himself was the right call. And that praise went directly into the deepest part of his identity. It told him that this is what people value in you. This is who they need you to be. And so he filed it away and carried it forward. That is not strength. That is the construction of a trap. And baseball said it gladly because it served the sport. What it did to the man was irrelevant. The praise he received for the Snickers game was the same praise he had been receiving his entire career for the same pattern. Push through. Never stop. Ignore the warning signals. Keep performing. And every time the crowd roared, that pattern got reinforced a little deeper. The accolades for playing through physical pain mapped perfectly onto his internal strategy for managing something far older and far more damaging than any food poisoning or torn rotator cuff. Here is another thing worth considering. The Snickers game was in August of 1996, the same season he was using steroids. The same season his body was being chemically overridden to perform at a level it could not naturally sustain. So the story being told to the public, the one about pure grit and willpower, was actually a story about a body held together with chemicals and sheer refusal to stop. The grit was real. The willpower was real. But the full picture was much more complicated than the legend that got passed down. The legend served baseball. It did not serve the man whose story it was supposed to be. That is what everybody saw. What nobody saw was what he was running from. A year after he retired in 2001, Ken Caminiti did something that shook the entire foundation of professional baseball. He sat down with Sports Illustrated and told the truth. Not a carefully managed public relations version, not a partial admission designed to protect his brand, the actual truth. He confirmed that he had used anabolic steroids during the 1996 season. He acknowledged that it was the chemical foundation beneath his MVP performance. And then he said something that changed the sport permanently. He estimated that 50% of Major League Baseball players were using steroids, half the league. That single number landed like a demolition charge in the middle of the sport. Before that cover story ran in June of 2002, the official position of Major League Baseball was that performance-enhancing drug use was a contained minor issue. The league's own estimates, based on testing procedures that were easy to circumvent and widely understood to be toothless, suggested something in the range of 5 to 7%. The players' union guarded its members fiercely. The owners liked what the long ball was doing for ticket sales and television ratings. The fans were enjoying the offensive fireworks. Everyone with a financial stake in the sport had a reason to look away, and so everyone did. Caminiti tore that comfortable fiction apart with one interview. His estimate of 50% was staggering. Some people disputed the exact number, but the broader culture he described, a league-wide environment of chemical enhancement that insiders knew about and almost no one discussed publicly, was confirmed over and over in the years that followed. Congressional hearings, the Mitchell Report, further player admissions, trainer testimonies. Each new revelation filled in more detail of the picture Caminiti had sketched. The outline he drew was accurate. What made his confession land even harder was the absence of remorse. He said plainly that he had made a lot of mistakes in his life, but he said using steroids was not one of them. Some people heard arrogance in that statement. Some heard self-justification. But listen carefully to what he was actually communicating. He was saying that in the environment he was in, surrounded by a culture of use and confronted with a body that was failing him and an organization that needed him healthy, the decision to use was not a personal moral failure. It was a response to a system that had created impossible demands and then looked the other way about how those demands were being met. That is a damning statement. Not about Ken Caminiti, about baseball. And consider what it took to make that confession in the first place. His career was already over. He had nothing to protect professionally, but he knew what speaking up would do to his public image. He knew he would be called a cheater. He knew some people would never look at his 1996 season the same way again. He said it anyway. He put the truth out in the open even when the truth was going to cost him, because the alternative was letting the lie keep standing. That is not the choice of a selfish person. That is the choice of someone who looked at the whole ugly picture and decided that honest testimony, even painful honest testimony, was worth more than a comfortable reputation. His 2002 confession was the primary catalyst that pushed the league toward mandatory drug testing. He paid a genuine price for that honesty. He was called a cheater publicly and often. His legacy became a source of debate rather than pure celebration. Some fans never forgave him, but the sport is more honest today because he chose to speak when speaking was costly. Now we have to talk about something that most coverage of this story consistently overlooks. Something that reframes everything. Because the steroids were not the beginning, the addiction did not start with baseball. By the time Ken Caminiti put on a major league uniform, the damage had already been done to him. Done by someone else. Done when he was a child. The 2022 biography, Playing Through the Pain, written by journalist Dan Good, using nearly 400 interviews, revealed that Caminiti had been a victim of childhood sexual abuse beginning in middle school. That disclosure is not a detail. It is the center of the entire story. Because once you know it, everything else connects in a way it simply did not before. His relationship with alcohol started in high school. He was a teenager reaching for something that could quiet the noise in his head. The noise that came from what had happened to him. He was not drinking for fun. He was drinking because it worked. Because for a little while, the memories lost their volume. The shame got smaller. The pain became manageable. And the human brain is a very efficient machine when it comes to remembering what works and wanting more of it. By the time he reached professional baseball, alcohol had been joined by amphetamines. The small pills called greenies were passed around major league clubhouses the way aspirin gets passed around an office. Players used them to stay sharp across a 162-game season. Caminiti used them for that reason too, but there was always another layer underneath. In rehabilitation sessions completed in 2001 and 2002, he disclosed the real function that drugs had been serving in his life. He said he used to turn his mind off. 4 words, just 4 words. But they carry the weight of an entire life of pain. Turn his mind off. Not to get an edge in competition. Not to bulk up or to hit the ball harder. To turn off a mind that, left alone in the dark, went to places he could not survive without chemical help. This is an important distinction that often gets lost in sports coverage. When people talk about athletes and addiction, they usually focus on performance, on the competitive edge, on the unfair advantage. But that framing misses the entire reality of what was driving Ken Caminiti. His substance use was not primarily about baseball. Baseball was the setting. The abuse was the cause. He would have been fighting the same war in any profession, in any city, regardless of whether he had ever picked up a baseball bat. The game gave him a stage and a spotlight, but the wound underneath was his to carry long before any of that. The steroids were for everyone else. For the Padres organization, for the fans, for the record books, for the MVP trophy, the cocaine and the opiates, those were for himself. Or rather, against himself, against the childhood that never stopped replaying, against the shame that success never dissolved. Crack cocaine entered the picture as his career wound down and after his retirement in 2001. Opiates followed, and then combinations. Each step deeper into harder substances was the same original request from the same original wound, just with a higher and higher dose required to achieve the same effect. The relief he had found in a beer in high school now required something far stronger. And each time he reached for something stronger, the hole in him got a little deeper. The failure to identify and treat the trauma underneath the performance during his playing years represents an enormous blind spot in what professional sports offered its athletes at that time. The idea that mental health treatment was as important as physical conditioning was essentially foreign to the culture of that era. The MLB did eventually provide some support through its employee assistance program, but by the time that help reached him in any meaningful way, the structural damage to his body and his life was already catastrophic. It came too late to reverse what had been building for 30 years. Now let us look at what was happening physically, because the chemistry here matters, and it explains why his death was not a random accident. It was the entirely predictable consequence of compounding damage accumulated over years. Anabolic steroids, when used over an extended period, cause cardiac hypertrophy. That means an unnatural thickening of the heart walls. The heart literally grows larger, but not in the way a heart gets stronger from exercise. This is pathological growth, growth that reduces efficiency rather than improving it. The heart muscle thickens but does not pump as well. The arteries can narrow over time. The risk of sudden cardiac failure increases dramatically. The toxicology report released by the New York City Medical Examiner on November 1st, 2004 listed both coronary artery disease and an enlarged heart as contributing factors in his death. Those conditions were not coincidental. They were the direct physical inheritance of the Superman years. Now place cocaine on top of that already compromised foundation. Cocaine inflicts severe short-term stress on the cardiovascular system. It causes the heart rate to accelerate rapidly. It causes blood vessels to constrict, making the heart work harder to push blood through narrower pathways. It sends blood pressure spiking to dangerous levels. For a person with a completely healthy heart, this alone carries serious risk. For a person with an enlarged, disease-damaged heart, using cocaine is comparable to forcing a damaged engine to run at maximum speed. The components are already strained. The extra load can snap them. But the speedball takes all of that and makes it worse in a very specific way. A speedball is a combination of cocaine and opiates. The reason this combination kills people is not simply that two powerful drugs are being taken at the same time. It is that they work against each other in a manner that disables the body's natural defense system. Cocaine is a stimulant. When a person uses too much, the body responds with alarm signals. The heart races uncomfortably, anxiety spikes, physical distress rises. Those warning signals are unpleasant, but they perform a critical function. They tell you to stop. Opiates are depressants. They slow the nervous system down, they suppress anxiety, they relax the body, and critically, they smother the discomfort that cocaine triggers. So instead of receiving the alarm that would naturally signal danger, the user feels calm. The body is not registering how far over the line it has already gone. And so more cocaine gets used than the system can survive. By the time the crisis arrives, there is no warning to act on. The damage is already irreversible. For Ken Caminiti, whose heart had been silently thickening and scarring through years of steroid use, this combination was not just dangerous. It was a near-certain death sentence at the dose that ended his life. The speedball that killed him in that Bronx bathroom was the final consequence of a chain that had been forming, link by link, across more than 2 decades of compounding damage. In the final 5 days of his life, the justice system had one more opportunity to intervene in the trajectory of a man who was clearly in crisis. On October 5, 2004, Ken Caminiti stood before a judge in Houston, Texas, and admitted that he had violated his probation by testing positive for cocaine in September of that year. This was not his first probation violation. It was his fourth. The judge sentenced him to 180 days in jail, a consequence that sounds significant when you read it on paper, but he was given full credit for time he had already served in treatment facilities. Because of that credit, he was released from the courthouse immediately. He walked out of that building a free man, and 5 days later he was dead. After his release, he traveled to New York. He was going to the Bronx to help his girlfriend's son navigate some legal issues, a gesture of loyalty that was entirely consistent with the person people who knew him described. He was staying at the apartment of a childhood friend on Seneca Avenue. The location was close to the stadium where he had played in the 1998 World Series with the Padres, a place connected to some of the best moments of his professional life, a neighborhood that should have held nothing but good memories. On the afternoon of October 10, 2004, Ken Caminiti went into the bathroom of that apartment. He used a speedball. When he emerged from the bathroom, he collapsed. Someone dialed 911 at 3:36 in the afternoon. Emergency responders came as fast as they could. but the combination of his severe, long-standing cardiac disease and the acute toxicity of the overdose left nothing to work with. He was transported to Lincoln Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 6:45 that evening. He was 41 years old. Now let us talk about the lie, because the lie is what the title promises and the story absolutely delivers. In the hours immediately after his collapse, before any official investigation had been completed, statements were released to the media. His agent and lawyer, Rick Licht, told reporters that Ken Caminiti had died of a heart attack. Just that, a simple heart attack. Clean, clinical, without any complicating context. The kind of death that does not carry shame. The kind of death that allows a family to grieve in peace and allows a sport to mourn without having to answer uncomfortable questions. But police sources began contradicting that account almost immediately. The picture from the apartment was not consistent with a natural cardiac event alone, and when the official toxicology report arrived on November 1st, 2004, the sanitized version of events collapsed entirely. The report confirmed what the early contradictions had suggested: accidental overdose, cocaine and opiates, a speedball, with coronary artery disease and an enlarged heart playing significant contributing roles. The heart attack story was not a complete lie. His heart did stop, and his heart was diseased. But the narrative being pushed in those first hours was shaped to avoid the parts of the truth that were inconvenient. It was a story designed to protect feelings and preserve reputations, rather than to honestly account for what had actually happened. And while you can understand the impulse to do that for a family in the immediate shock of grief, the problem is that the instinct to reach for the comfortable version over the honest one did not originate in that moment. It was already an established habit, because the deeper lie was never about how Ken Caminiti died on that particular afternoon in the Bronx. The deeper lie was about what the sport had known and chosen to ignore for the entire era that produced him. Caminiti's 2002 confession described a culture where the use of performance-enhancing drugs was an open secret at every level of the organization. Managers knew, team doctors knew, front office personnel knew, trainers knew, the whole structure of professional baseball knew. And the whole structure decided, collectively and individually, to maintain the fiction of clean competition, because the alternative, honesty, would have disrupted revenues and complicated legacies and forced a reckoning nobody wanted to have. Caminiti forced the reckoning anyway, and the sport never entirely forgave him for it. 2 years later, the man who had done the sport the difficult favor of telling the truth was dead at 41. And the first story out of the building was that it was just a heart attack. Now bring all of it together, because this is where the full tragedy becomes visible. A child is abused in middle school and does not get help. He finds alcohol at 15, discovers that it quiets the noise, and files that information away. He develops into an extraordinary baseball player because he has genuine talent, and also because he is incredibly willing to hurt himself in service of the game. That willingness gets praised constantly. It reinforces every destructive pattern he already carries. He reaches the major leagues and finds the culture of chemical enhancement completely normalized. Faced with serious injuries that threaten his career and his identity, he makes the bargain. The Superman season follows. The MVP follows. The records follow. And underneath all of it, the heart begins to change in ways nobody is watching. He retires. The steroids are gone, but the cardiac damage they left behind is permanent. The cocaine and the opiates, which were never about baseball, but about something much older, escalate without the structure of a season to organize his days around. The legal system catches him 4 times in probation violations and recycles him back into the same environment each time. 5 days before his death, a judge gives him a sentence with full credit for time served and sends him home. And then comes the bathroom in the Bronx. And then comes the speedball. And then comes silence. But here's what needs to be said, and what the end of this story demands. Ken Caminiti was loved, deeply and genuinely loved by people who knew him well. His teammates did not talk about him in terms of statistics when they remembered him. They talked about what it felt like to have him in the dugout, about the way his presence changed the entire mood of a clubhouse, about the way he fought for his teammates with a loyalty that was almost old-fashioned in its intensity. He cared about the people around him in ways that went far beyond professional obligation. In May of 2016, the San Diego Padres elected him to their Hall of Fame. On August 6th of that year, the induction ceremony was held at Petco Park. His daughters were there. His former teammates were there. The tributes paid that day were not about the MVP trophy or the franchise records, though those were honored too. They were about his loyalty, his heart, his ferocity as a competitor, and his gentleness as a person in private. They were about a man who had given everything he had to the game and to the people who played it alongside him. That ceremony meant something beyond just honoring a number on a wall. It was a statement by the organization that the full picture of a person matters, that the complexity of a human life, including the failures and the struggles, does not erase the love and the excellence and the impact. His daughter stood on that field and spoke about their father, not about the statistics, about the man, about who he was when the cameras were off and the stadium was empty. That image of his family on the field at Petco Park years after he was gone is one of the most honest moments in the whole story, because it says clearly that the people who knew him best did not reduce him to his worst moments. They held the whole of him, and they were proud to say his name out loud. That is a complicated legacy, and it is supposed to be complicated, because Ken Caminiti was not a simple person. He was capable of enormous generosity and enormous self-destruction, sometimes almost simultaneously. He loved deeply, and he suffered in ways that most people around him could only guess at. He performed beautifully for a public that adored him, while carrying privately the weight of a childhood that never loosened its grip. He is buried at the Cambo Ranch in Sabinal, Texas, a property he co-owned with his longtime teammate and his close friend, Craig Biggio. A quiet and peaceful place, far from stadiums and scoreboards and the kind of noise that baseball generates. A reminder of the genuine bonds he built with people despite everything he was carrying inside. So what do we actually take from this? What does the life and death of Ken Caminiti actually mean in terms we can use? It means that playing through the pain is not always strength. Sometimes it is simply pain that no one has the courage to look at honestly. It means that the tough guy image, the Superman image, carries a cost that never shows up on the field. It always shows up somewhere else, usually in private, usually at a price that nobody sees coming until it is already too late to do anything about it. It means that a sport or a workplace or any institution that rewards self-destruction and ignores trauma is not building toughness. It is building a slow disaster. It is constructing the conditions for the kind of tragedy that ends with a 911 call at 3:36 in the afternoon. Ken Caminiti drove in 130 runs in the 1996 season, a record that still belongs to the San Diego Padres. He did it with a torn rotator cuff, a body sustained by steroids, and a mind haunted by a childhood he never got help processing. That is not a story about a cheater. That is a story about a human being who was asked to be superhuman for the benefit of a sport that did not fully consider what the asking cost him. And here's the thing that should stay with you after this video ends. There are Ken Caminitis in locker rooms right now, in high schools and colleges and professional leagues, young men and women who are performing at extraordinary levels while carrying wounds that nobody is examining, who are being praised for pushing through, who are learning every single day that the crowd loves you most when you ignore what your body and your mind are trying to tell you. That lesson gets taught in 1,000 small moments, and it takes a very long time to unlearn. If baseball and every other sport took the lesson of his life seriously, the culture would look different today. It would ask harder questions. It would build better support. It would care about the person before the performance. Whether that has truly happened is a question worth keeping. Every system around him failed at a critical moment. Baseball built the myth and looked away from what was underneath it. The courts cycled him through on a revolving door that deposited him back into the same danger every time. The medical and mental health infrastructure of the sport came far too late to reach the wound that had been driving everything. And on the day he died, the instinct was to reach for the comfortable story rather than the honest one. He deserved better than any of that. He deserved a sport that cared about the man as much as it cared about his batting average. He deserved help when he was a scared kid in middle school. He deserved to be told that it was okay to sit out the Monterey game. He deserved teammates and coaches and organizations that saw what was happening and responded with something more meaningful than applause. He did not get those things. And that is a failure that belongs to a culture, not to one individual. If this story moved you, leave a comment and let me know your thoughts. What do you think baseball still gets wrong today? What do you think has changed and what has not? Hit like if this was worth your time. Subscribe if you want more stories that go past the highlights and into what the game actually costs the people who play it. There are a lot more coming. Ken Caminiti was the heart and soul of his team. Every person who ever played alongside him said so without hesitation. And then one afternoon in October 2004, in a Bronx apartment near a stadium that held memories of a World Series, that heart finally stopped. Not because of one bad decision made in isolation and in darkness. Because of 100 systems that failed to protect a child, a player, and a man who needed protection at every stage and almost never received it. He was not doing okay. He had not been okay for a very long time. And the saddest part of this entire story is not the headline. The saddest part is that nobody asked loudly enough or early enough or with enough genuine willingness to sit with the answer, even if it was difficult and costly and did not fit neatly into the story the sport preferred to tell about itself.